Welcome to the creative section of this online course, where we will be talking about what it takes to become a great cinematographer and make your images look cinematic. Now, as the basic component to great cinematography is learning great composition. Composition is the placement or arrangement of visual elements or ingredients in a photo or frame of video. In other words, just as food has ingredients that makes it taste good, an image has ingredients that makes it look aesthetically pleasing or beautiful. And so I want to discuss with you my top 10 rules of composition. Now understand, these are more of guidelines than rules. Rules are made to be broken, and I'm the first that will tell you I love to break the rules, but you can't break them if you don't know them, so pay attention. Rule number 1 is fill the frame. This is one of the biggest problems I see plaguing beginning filmmakers is they don't fill the frame with the subject. They have too much dead space. For example, in this shot I took in Guatemala, I have too much dead space here in the grass and up in the trees, and my subject isn't filling up very much of my frame. Now, if you aren't filling up your frame, you got two choices. 1, zoom in, or 2, get closer. And the latter is almost always going to be better. But in this case, I could not get closer because it was raining, so I had to stay under shelter and I could only zoom in. And when I zoomed in, look at the difference it makes. My subject is now filling up a lot more of the frame and making you feel more a part of the action. This is one of the elements that sets apart the work I did at Devon Supertramp from so many other filmmakers, is that we were willing to get as close as we could to the action and fill the frame with our subject. Look at this clip. The tire is almost hitting my camera because I'm so close to it. But look how much of the frame it's filling up. It makes you feel like you're there, part of the action. Here's another example from Guatemala where my subject is actually super small again, but it's because I want to show off these cool looking houses with the tin roof on top. And so in this one I'm okay with my subject being smaller because I'm wanting you to focus just as much on the background. However, I followed up with a shot of just the two boys pushing their tire, filling up the frame, and that then allowed me to cut between them in my edit. But don't leave a lot of background unless you're doing it intentionally and want the viewer to see what's in the background. Here's another example of me getting as close as I can to the action, almost falling off the cliff, but filling my frame with my subject, and then cutting to a wide shot where my subject can barely be seen, but I did that on purpose because I wanted to show the magnitude of the cliff. So don't be afraid to not fill the frame, but understand why you're not filling it, and it's because you're intentionally wanting to show the background. I'm now going to show you a good and a bad example of filling the frame with your subjects. I shot this wedding video. I try and get as close to my subjects and fill them with my entire frame so that you can feel their emotion and feel like you're a part of the action. Compare that to this wedding video I pulled off the internet. Notice how much frame is filled with our couple, which should be our subject, and how much of our frame is filled with dead background that really doesn't add anything to the scene. I think we could go without seeing most of this and be okay. So compare those two side by side, and you'll see the difference it makes to fill up your frame by getting closer to your subject. But it's not only about filling the frame, it's about not filling the frame as well. For example, in this shot, the subject is filling the frame just fine, but what else is filling the frame? This guy, that lady, this cooler, and none of it really matters or pertains to what we want the viewer to be focused on, which is the couple. So ask yourself, is the background important? If not, then eliminate it. Rule number 2 is the rule of thirds. It basically means to chop your frame into thirds and put points of interest and importance on one of these lines. When working with landscapes, you want to try and put your horizon on one of these two lines, either on the bottom third or the top third, depending on what's more important. Do you want your viewer to be more focused on the sky, or do you want them to be more focused on the land? When working with people, you want to try and keep them on one of the vertical lines and try and keep their eye line on the top third. And be sure to give them some lead room or looking room, which means whichever way they're looking, you want to put more space in your image in front of them than you do behind them. Also be aware of headroom. It's the distance between the head and the top of the image. Don't cut off people's faces or don't give them way too much space above their head. You want to try and keep their head around that top third of your image. An exception to this rule would be unconventional framing, where you're purposely giving too much headroom, but make sure you have a creative reason why you're doing it so it doesn't come across as just bad framing. Another exception to the rule is when you want your image to have equal visual weight, which brings us to our third rule, which is symmetry. Now, in this clip, I had 4 layers of background. I had water, land, trees, and sky. And so instead of trying to split it up into thirds, I just split this right down the middle, creating 4 sections and giving my image symmetry. A great time to use symmetry is when you have a reflection of water that makes your top and bottom look the same. And here's an example of a symmetrical building. And so I placed my subject in the very middle to create symmetry in the image. Rule number 4 is creating depth. When I say depth, I mean having contrast between your foreground and your background. I personally love creating depth by finding something in my foreground to glide up against that then reveals something else that's more important in the background. When it comes to cinematography, foreground helps create movement in your image. For instance, I could have just taken a shot of this lake, but instead I found a tree and a fence that I could glide against that created movement and layers and depth. At Bryce Canyon National Park, I could have taken a shot of just the amazing landscape, but I found a protruding ledge, had my wife go out on it, and used her as foreground to the amazing background, giving me movement and giving me depth. A really good tool to creating depth is lowering your aperture, which creates a shallow depth of field, which then can put your foreground in focus and your background out of focus, or vice versa, creating a 3D effect and making your visual come to life and feel like you're experiencing it yourself as you're watching. So use those two tools, foreground and a low aperture, to create depth. Rule number 5 is leading lines, which means use natural lines to lead your eye into the center of the picture or into your subject. Lines are a very powerful visual aid to help draw your eye into your subject, and they will also contribute to creating depth as well. Rule number 6, similar to leading lines, is diagonal lines, which also create movement and take your eyes from one line to another, and once again they do a great job of creating more depth in your image. Rule number 7 is patterns and repetition. Patterns and repetition are aesthetically pleasing to the eye. You will often find it in man-made buildings and structures. As a cinematographer, always be on the lookout for patterns and repetition to help make your image more interesting. Rule number 7 is framing. Use the lines that you see around you in buildings and in structures to help frame up your image. Here's a good and a bad example of me framing up this image correctly. You'll see that this pillar isn't lined up vertically and my horizon isn't lined up horizontally. And so I corrected it on my second take by lining up all those lines and framing my image better. You can also find natural framing around you in windows and doors and buildings and arches to help create new shapes and patterns in your framing. Rule number 9 is dominance. Take a look at this image and tell me what the dominant subject is. Is it the tarp hanging over the balcony? Is it the bike? Is it the grass? This image makes me confused because I don't know what I'm supposed to be looking at. There's no dominant subject. In this image, I'd say the dominant subject is the looming volcano behind the buildings, but very easily you could make the dominating subject this archway by shooting at a different angle and a different focal length. You now put the volcano very small and in the background, and your dominating subject now becomes the building. So make sure you know what part of your image you want to be the dominant subject and shoot it in a way that is going to make it pop out as the dominating subject. A good way to help your viewer know what the dominating subject is by bringing your aperture down, creating a shallow depth of field, and separating your subject from your background. This is why I personally love shooting at low apertures, is because it helps your viewer focus on what it's supposed to be looking at. Let's go back to our good and bad example of the two wedding shots. And though they both show the bride and groom as the dominant subjects, it's a lot easier to focus on the bride and groom on the left because everything behind them is knocked out of focus, whereas the image on the right has people walking in the background, and they are also in focus because they use a high aperture. Give your image a dominant subject to help your viewer focus on what they are supposed to focus on. And speaking of focus, number 10 is focus. Even if you follow all the other rules of composition, if your image isn't in focus, then it's not going to look good. Here's an amazing shot I took of this wedding couple, but when I got back to the editing room, I realized they are not in focus. His shoulder's in focus, but their faces are not. Another example of this was a music video I shot with the Gardner sisters. I did a close-up of Ali singing at an aperture of 1.4, and somewhere within her performance, she moved positions and came out of focus, and the rest of the take was out of focus. So I had her do another take, told her not to move this time, got a second take with her eyes in focus, and it made all the difference. So once again, composition is important, but rules are made to be broken. So innovate, get creative, and create your own style by doing what looks best to you. If you guys have any further questions about composition, please let me know.